Rick Ross just walked into the biggest ambush of Rick Ross' entire career. And the wildest part is that Rick Ross laid every single trap by hand. Not Drake, not 50 Cent, not a mystery blogger with a burner account. Rick Ross. The same Rick Ross who spent 3 straight months walking podcast to podcast, chest puffed out, chains swinging, telling anyone with a microphone that Set in Stone was already a classic before a single fan had heard a single bar. 3 months of promises. 3 months of shots. 3 months of Rick Ross swearing on camera that Rick Ross was operating on a level that other rappers could not reach. Then the album dropped, and the entire hip-hop internet did something nobody thought was possible in 2026. Every side agreed on one thing. Every side laughed at the same joke. Every side pointed at the same album cover. And the joke was Rick Ross. Hold that in your head for a second, because this is not a normal flop story. This is not a rapper missing a beat. This is a self-inflicted collapse. Filmed in slow motion, uploaded in 4K, and set to a soundtrack Rick Ross recorded personally. Nobody has ever watched a veteran of this size walk into a shredder with this much confidence. And the shredder was already turned on, humming, waiting, before Rick Ross even stepped near it. So sit with this, because the story behind Set in Stone is not really about a bad album. It is about a bigger question that hip-hop has been dodging for 2 years, and Rick Ross accidentally forced everybody to answer out loud. That question is at the end. You will not want to miss it. Rewind to the promo run. Every interview, every clip, every barbershop podcast, Rick Ross showed up swinging. Rick Ross laughed at Drake numbers. Rick Ross laughed at the streams. Rick Ross said the streets do not lie, and the fake numbers flood the marketplace, and only real listeners recognize real music. Rick Ross went on camera and said Drake needed a stimulus package. Rick Ross joked that Rick Ross saw Drake on a plane, flying economy, and Rick Ross laughed about it in front of a live crowd. Rick Ross openly questioned whether Drake even writes anymore. Rick Ross reached back and grabbed 50 Cent by the collar. Rick Ross even fired a stray in the general direction of Jay-Z, which is something most rappers would not even whisper in a locked bathroom. Every single one of those shots was engineered to do one thing: keep Rick Ross trending until the album dropped, because if the name stays hot, the release feels like an event. That was the plan. That was the whole plan. And on paper, the plan almost made sense. Controversy is fuel. Beef sells. Podcasts print money off pull quotes. Rick Ross has been in this game since Trilla, since Teflon Don, since Rich Forever, and Rick Ross knows how the machine runs better than most executives who sign the checks. So, watching Rick Ross press every red button on the console was not random. It was calculated. Rick Ross wanted the same wave that carried Drake and Kendrick through their war last year. Rick Ross wanted the timeline glued to Rick Ross. Rick Ross wanted the whole culture holding its breath until Set in Stone dropped. And the culture did hold its breath, just not for the reason Rick Ross wanted. Because here is the part nobody in Rick Ross camp seemed to see coming. When you spend 90 days telling the world you are a giant, the world does not show up ready to enjoy the album. The world shows up ready to measure. Every claim gets a receipt. Every boast gets a scoreboard. Every shot fired becomes a shot that has to be answered by the music itself. And the music, according to almost every corner of hip-hop Twitter, did not answer. Not even close. That is the trap Rick Ross built. That is the trap Rick Ross walked into. And that is the trap Rick Ross is still trying to explain a way out of, one interview at a time, one deflection at a time, one uncomfortable smile at a time. Set in Stone dropped, and within hours the tone flipped. The very same clips of Rick Ross laughing about Drake's stream started showing up in split screens next to Rick Ross' own first day numbers. Reports circulating online pegged the opening at roughly 1.8 million streams on day one. In the modern streaming economy, that translates to somewhere around 1,220 album equivalent sales. 1,200 for a veteran of this stature, for an album that was supposedly, in Rick Ross' own words, set in stone. Fans did the math in real time. Screenshots started stacking. Charts started circulating. Comment sections turned into a courtroom. And the verdict was ugly, immediate, and impossible to walk back. Then came the second wave. And the second wave is what really broke the internet. 50 Cent, who has been sharpening this knife since 2009, saw the numbers, opened Instagram, and did what 50 Cent always does. 50 Cent posted a message that read, essentially, that 50 Cent had just seen Rick Ross record sales, and 50 Cent was laughing. 2,000 units. 50 Cent added a punchline for good measure. Then 50 Cent reposted old clips of Rick Ross calling other artists flops. Then 50 Cent posted more. Then more. Every hour, another jab. Every jab, another 100,000 impressions. And Rick Ross could not respond with numbers. Because the numbers were the joke. Rick Ross could not respond with silence. Because silence looked like surrender. Rick Ross was stuck in a corner Rick Ross built by hand. Meanwhile, Drake did not even have to say anything. That is the part that stings the most. Drake did not fire a single subliminal. Drake did not post a caption. Drake did not need to. Fans dug up an old bar where Drake joked about aiding Rick Ross streams, a line that at the time sounded like standard beef talk. And suddenly that bar was quoted 1,000,000 times because it aged into prophecy overnight. One recent Drake single was reportedly outstreaming the entire set in Stone Tracklist. One song beat a whole album. The math did not need commentary. The math was the commentary. And Drake did not lift a finger. Now zoom back to what Rick Ross was actually rapping about on the album itself, because this is where the wound gets deeper. Instead of using Set in Stone to prove the point Rick Ross was making in every interview, Rick Ross doubled down on the dices. On the album, Rick Ross reignited the 50 Cent war for the 100th time. On the album, Rick Ross questioned whether Drake writes. On the album, Rick Ross even nudged in the direction of Jay-Z. Fans were not talking about the songs. Fans were talking about the shots inside the songs. And that is the death spiral, because it means the music itself became a footnote to the drama, which meant the drama had to carry the whole project, which meant when the drama fizzled, there was nothing left to hold up the release. Every side of hip-hop Twitter, and this is the part that has never happened at this scale, actually agreed. One post went viral saying every corner of rap Twitter finally united to agree that the album was a mess. Backpack rap Twitter agreed. Trap Twitter agreed. Kendrick fans agreed. Drake fans agreed. Even the neutral fans who usually stay out of these fights agreed. Someone posted that the animation on the cover art moved like a low-budget PowerPoint. Someone else said the flow sounded like a bad karaoke run at a Future song. Someone else compared the cadences to Juicy J. Someone else said Rick Ross was doing a Kendrick impression and losing. The jokes did not stop for a week. The memes did not stop for a week. The comment sections did not stop for a week. And the album, buried under all of it, never got a fair listen from anybody who was not already committed to defending Rick Ross. And here's a detail that almost nobody has stopped to point at. Even though it is sitting right in the middle of the whole rollout, Rick Ross did not just diss Drake in interviews. Rick Ross did not just diss Drake on the album. Rick Ross built a live show moment around it. In one clip, Rick Ross told a DJ to play a certain song on stage without the Drake vocals. Rick Ross told fans to sing along. Rick Ross told fans to call Drake a name. Rick Ross laughed on stage while doing it. And then, hours later, Rick Ross went on a different podcast, softened the tone, and said shout out to Drake. Said Rick Ross had Drake number on speed dial before Drake was famous. Said Rick Ross used to know Drake back when Drake had a different look. Two completely different versions of Rick Ross, in the same news cycle, on the same rollout, aimed at the same target. Fans noticed. Fans clipped it. Fans looped it. Think about how strange that footage looks now, played back with a 1,200 first week number stamped in the corner of the screen. A rapper telling a crowd to sing a diss track, without the target vocals, while the target is quietly outstreaming that rapper entire album with one loose single. A rapper claiming credit for knowing the target before fame, while begging the same target to make another song, while dissing the same target on wax. It is not one lane. It is not two lanes. It is 4 lanes at once, and none of them lead anywhere except back to the same 1,200 number on the scoreboard. Then the tour tickets went on sale, and somehow the story got worse. Screenshots of the seating map for a Miami date started spreading, and the map looked like a green field. Green dot after green dot after green dot. Empty seats stacked in every section. Rick Ross' team responded by rolling out a buy one, get one half off promotion, which is a kind of promotion a struggling comedy club runs on a Tuesday, not the kind of promotion a supposed rap legend runs in a home market. The internet screenshotted the discount, put it next to the album streams, put it next to the 50 Cent posts, and the picture that formed was devastating. It did not look like a rollout. It looked like a controlled demolition. And in the middle of all of this, Rick Ross tried to pivot. In an interview clip that resurfaced, Rick Ross said Rick Ross does not care about album sales, that Rick Ross only cares about the music, that Rick Ross only cares about quality. That would be a beautiful thing to say if Rick Ross had not spent the last 90 days doing the exact opposite. 90 days of counting Drake numbers. 90 days of laughing at other rappers' streams. 90 days of measuring hip-hop with a scoreboard. You cannot spend a whole quarter using numbers as a weapon, and then, the second the numbers turn on you, announce that numbers do not matter. That is not humility. That is a receipt. And the internet does not forget receipts. Here is where the story gets even more interesting, because there's a version of this collapse where Rick Ross could have been rescued by critical praise. There have been albums that flopped commercially but earned lasting respect for their artistry. Killer Mike walked that road and came out with a Grammy. Some fans' hope set in stone would be that kind of moment, a slow burner, a grower, a record for the real ones. But the critical response mirrored the commercial response. Reviewers said the album lacked a spine. Reviewers said the tracklist felt like a collection of unrelated features glued together with disrespect. Reviewers said the big-name guests never locked in with the direction of the project, because there was no direction to lock into. So both lanes closed at the same time. No numbers. No critical shield. Just the memes. Zoom out even further, because this is the part that most breakdowns miss, and this is the part nobody else is telling you. What happened to Rick Ross this week is not really about Rick Ross. It is about the exact moment hip-hop crossed a line that Rick Ross helped draw. For the last 2 years, veteran rappers have been sending a specific message to a specific generation. That message is simple. If your streams are not our streams, you are not real. If your sales are not our sales, you are not real. If you cannot move units the way legends moved units, you are washed. Rick Ross was one of the loudest voices carrying that flag. Rick Ross helped make the streaming leaderboard into a courtroom. Rick Ross helped make first week numbers into a moral test. Rick Ross helped teach a whole generation of fans to open the Billboard chart before opening their ears. And then Rick Ross dropped an album, and the exact same courtroom Rick Ross helped build turnaround and put Rick Ross on the stand. That is not karma. That is not irony. That is a mirror. The mirror Rick Ross polished for 2 years finally got held up to Rick Ross' own face. Every metric Rick Ross used against Drake was suddenly a metric that could be used against Rick Ross. Every joke Rick Ross made about first week sales was suddenly a joke that could be made about Rick Ross' first week sales. Every clip of Rick Ross laughing at another rapper's streams became a clip that could be split screen with Rick Ross' own streams. The culture did not turn on Rick Ross. The culture just used the rule book Rick Ross wrote. There's a receipt from earlier this year that makes the whole Rick Ross situation even more brutal. Rick Ross went on record calling another artist's album a flop, even though that album moved well over 400,000 units in its first week. 400,000 versus 1,200. Sit with that gap for a second. Sit with the audacity it took to call 400,000 flop from a mouth that was about to produce 1,200. That is not confidence. That is a countdown timer. And every fan on the internet was watching that timer tick down in real time, second by second, day by day, until zero. Rick Ross' tour situation adds another layer that a lot of people are missing. In the current market, a headliner selling out a hometown Miami show should be automatic. Miami is Rick Ross' fortress. Miami is Rick Ross' backyard. Miami is where Rick Ross should be able to fill a room with nothing but a tweet and a promo poster. Instead, the seating map looked like a golf course. Green everywhere. Discount codes flying. Teams scrambling. And every empty seat was a data point in a bigger conversation about whether the streaming era has finally decoupled name recognition from actual demand. You can be famous. You can be legacy. You can be legendary. And you can still not be able to fill a room in your own city. That is a new reality, and Rick Ross is a case study. Then there is the interview moment quietly making the rounds, where Rick Ross was asked whether Rick Ross was putting the Drake beef to rest. Rick Ross answered by saying Set in Stone is all about etching a little bit at a time. The interviewer, trying to translate, asked if Rick Ross was squashing the beef. Rick Ross said Rick Ross did not know what that meant. Watch that clip back with the numbers in mind. Watch that clip back after the 50-cent posts. Watch that clip back with the Miami seating chart on your other monitor. It is a completely different clip. It is not confidence anymore. It is a man trying to keep a door propped open while the wind is already blowing it shut. Rick Ross is still one of the best pens rap has ever produced. That is not a debate. That is a fact stamped into 2 decades of catalog. Deeper than rap, Teflon Don. God forgives I don't. Those albums are not accidents. Those albums are surgery. Rick Ross has bars that other rappers frame on the wall. Rick Ross has a delivery that a whole region built its sound around. Nobody is arguing about the talent. What everybody is arguing about is the strategy. And the strategy this cycle was a strategy of a man who trusted the beef more than the music, who trusted the podcast more than the pen, who trusted the mirror more than the mic. And the strategy cracked in public, live, with the whole culture watching. Rick Ross will recover, because Rick Ross has too much catalog and too much stubbornness to disappear. But this week will echo for years to come. Every future rollout Rick Ross runs will now be compared to this one, and every future boast will carry the weight of this exact scoreboard. The next veteran who tries the same numbers as a weapon playbook will do it knowing this footage exists. Somewhere, a room full of managers is already rewriting press strategy because of what just happened to Rick Ross. And the fans watching all of this are learning a lesson the industry has been trying to hide for a decade, which is that the leaderboard is not a friend, and it is not a weapon. It is a mirror, and the mirror only reflects whoever is standing in front of it at the moment the numbers land. That is the reality Rick Ross just handed the whole culture, whether Rick Ross meant to or not. And once a lesson lands publicly in front of this many witnesses, that lesson does not unland. Every rapper on every label just watched this collapse happen in real time and quietly took notes. Every executive who greenlit a beef-heavy rollout this year just saw the ceiling of that whole approach. Every fan who ever cheered a diss track over a full album just felt the ground shift underneath them. The next legend who steps into the ring with numbers as a weapon will step in knowing this footage exists. Every clip from the Rick Ross press run has already been cataloged, time-stamped, and turned into a receipt. Producers who worked on Set in Stone are quietly distancing themselves from the rollout on private group chats. Even the loyal Miami crowd that has ridden with Rick Ross since Poor Miami is asking harder questions than usual. Journalists who defended Rick Ross' rollout for months are now scrubbing headlines and rewriting the timeline in silence. Blog writers who dismissed the doubters 2 weeks ago are now stitching together explainer videos to salvage some credibility. Streaming playlists have already begun replacing Set in Stone tracks with older Rick Ross catalog cuts that fans still trust. Younger artists watching this rollout in real time just learned a masterclass in exactly what not to do on a comeback cycle. Fans will still be quoting Set in Stone posts a full year from now, and probably a lot longer than that. The hardest lesson buried inside all of this is not about Rick Ross. It is about the way the whole culture talks about hip-hop now. Because if Set in Stone had dropped in 2007, we would be talking about the bars. We would be talking about the beats. We would be pulling apart lyrics line by line. We would be arguing about which feature stole the show. Instead, we are talking about a seating chart, a 50-cent Instagram post, a Miami discount code, and a set of streaming numbers. That shift did not happen because Rick Ross made a bad album. That shift happened because the entire culture, Rick Ross included, taught fans to look at the scoreboard before the songs. And once the scoreboard becomes a story, the songs never get a fair fight. So here's the final question, the one Rick Ross accidentally forced the entire culture to ask this week. Is hip-hop still about the music, or is hip-hop about the numbers? Because if the answer is the music, then Rick Ross deserves a real listen without the memes, without the seating charts, without the 50-cent captions. And if the answer is the numbers, then every rapper who ever laughed at another rapper streams is one bad Friday away from being the next Rick Ross. There is no middle. There is no soft version. It is one or the other. And Rick Ross has just become the loudest possible reminder of what happens when the culture picks the wrong one at the worst possible moment. Drop your answer in the comments right now. Tell me who is next. Tell me if Rick Ross deserves a smoke or a second chance. Because this story is barely starting, and hip-hop will remember the week Rick Ross set it in stone, then watch the stone crack in real time.